Most unlikely of villains, smooths of brain and for pause. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it boggle? Does it meow? In the lair of the cerebral bore, and will show him so much more. We'll leave your brains at the door.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another bonus episode of Cerebrivore. The episode just starts off with us talking. This episode is about movies that influenced our gaming. The introductions are a little bit later, but I just wanted to let you know what was happening so when you hear the talking, you're not confused on what it is. We didn't leave the front out. It's just a recorded ramble. That's why it's a bonus episode. We'll have a standard panel episode about something, I'm not sure what, next week. Enjoy the show.
All right, Jason's gonna record us, get some dirt on us as we talk about stuff.
Usually, what he does is
Carl, you just went robot
and puts it in front as like a little intro or opener. No, that's the way I talk. I'm a robot. Good morning. Hello, my name is Carl. No, I could do the guy from Sling Blade. My name is Carl. They call him a Carl. Some people call it a cosplay, but I call it Sling Blade. Or is it the other way around?
you do a good Cookie Monster and Hill. You do a good Bane too.
A Bane? Oh yeah. Hello,
this
is Bane. How are you today? This morning?
Yeah,
the Bane from the cartoon, from the
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you do a good job doing that, actually. Seriously.
But I don't think
I defeated you.
Yeah, you got to cover it.
He does talk. Yeah, but he does, right?
Yeah, he's got that kind of weird, like,
what was the actor's name?
Tom Hardy.
Yeah, Tom Hardy does talk like that in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's up with. I like Tom Hardy a lot, although I think part of it is that performance is kind of in a really weird place, and also he was on like a ton of steroids and stuff, so he probably wasn't in his right place because he put on like 40 pounds of muscle for that role, which is like you can't do that in 2 months just natural, right? No amount of protein can get you 40 pounds of muscle naturally, right?
Right. And the other thing is Nolan is on record, not just with that movie, but also with Interstellar and some other movies. Nolan doesn't care if you can hear the audio, the dialogue, right? He's been on record saying that the feeling and like the ambiance. So like when he surges music over the dialogue and stuff, he does it on purpose.
Yeah.
His intention, now obviously at home, you're going to watch subtitles or whatever, but in the theater, like he wants you to miss some of the dialogue.
Well, and I actually really like that about Nolan's movies, especially I don't think it works as well in the Dark Knight movies and in Interstellar, but certainly in Dunkirk, I remember people being like, oh, you can't hear the dialogue over the sound of the Stukas dive bombing. It's like, yeah, that's the fucking point. Like Stukas are really fucking loud. So of course you can't hear people talking over the sound of, war. Like that's like the whole point of the movie is that the war is so, loud and all consuming that you just can't have kind of normal human relations in its presence, right? Like that's basically the central theme of Dunkirk, right?
Yeah. Speaking of Tom Hardy, did you guys ever see that Taboo series? It's like an 8-episode series.
Yeah.
So he was strange in that one too.
Intentionally, right?
Did you guys see Bronson? That's him as Charles Bronson, not the actor, but as the prisoner who took the name.
Yeah,
I was born into this world, Michael Peterson, but I'll go out with my fighting name, Bronson.
Yeah, Bronson's good. Taboo's interesting because it's that whole colonial period, right? And you got the East India Tea Company, you got all the other stuff going on.
Yeah, it's 1814. Yeah, right after the defeat of Napoleon. I'd been hoping for a second series, but I guess it never got picked up because the second series would have taken place in the New World in British Columbia. But oh well.
It was pretty good. But
that show has never influenced any of my. Well, maybe it has influenced some of the way I think about sort of Victorian or pre-Victorian era England games. I guess for Call of Cthulhu.
Well, there you go. So hold that thought.
Jason's favorite historical game.
Let me do the intro so we can launch the show, and we can actually dive into it. That's great for the show. Hey, folks, this is Jason, Nerds RPG Fridaycast. Welcome back to Cerebrivore. Today, I'm joined by Arlen Walker of one of those shows, Live from Helm's
that
Wasteland.
one.
Yep, that one. Now, Arlen Walker has the wonderful Live from Helm's Wasteland YouTube channel and podcast. And Carl Rodriguez is the geomologist, presents the show his wife lets him put on. So we really appreciate you guys joining today. And today we're going to talk, as you heard a little bit of Carl there before I launched the intro, we're going to talk about movies, or it could be other media, we're going to do moving media. We're not going to do literature today, but movies, or it could be TV shows that maybe have influenced our gaming. So it should be an exciting topic. This is just a bonus episode, but I hope you guys enjoy it. So who wants to go first? I'll let one of you guys run with it. Carl, do you want to keep talking about Taboo, which you were talking about there at the beginning?
No, because I mean, Taboo in itself would be an interesting background campaign setting, but that's not like what I would hitch my hat on for what has influenced me in gaming. I think
Awesome.
What influenced me in gaming, what I was thinking about the most was Aliens, right? Not the first, even both the Aliens franchise, well, at least the first two, and maybe Prometheus or whatever, some of the other ones. But that whole like horror sci-fi, I think that's really influenced me in running games. And I actually, for way back for Star Frontiers, I ran like a version of another bug hunt, where they landed on this, had to rescue this colony, and it went south very quickly. And I think one of the fun things is it kind of, my plot was aliens, but one of the fun things, I didn't use like Geiger aliens, but some sort of alien hive type of thing. But the funny thing in that is that one of the players did sort of cook off, and they rolled like a 00 and had to cook off with his weapon and destroyed the nuclear power plant cooling system. And at least that's what we said when we were in high school or early college. We didn't really know how these things worked. So kind of same thing happened in Aliens. It's like you had a meltdown. So so they got to say that. I think the cool thing about that is, like, I think probably in a lot of games that we have all played, someone always tries to quote Aliens. I think that comes up a lot, right?
Well, it's a very quotable
days,
movie.
You won't last 17 hours. That type of thing. Monsters come out only at night. Those type of quotes. But I think that definitely has influenced the way I would like to see like sci-fi, like a military sci-fi, and sort of the technology, the sort of not over the top space opera technology that we see in Star Wars or the post scarcity society we see in Star Trek, but the kind of aliens, like almost near sci-fi in the next 200, 300 years that we might think or conceive that how things are set and ground, like our visuals, right? Like they still use the type of weapons we use, more sophisticated, the type of assault rifle type things that we might use or whatever. No fancy laser guns. And the way the ships and the equipment looks like near sci-fi. And I think that's what definitely has influenced me in trying to conceive and communicate my science fiction to my players, for sure. I think, and just the quips, the plot, the action driven, the kind of the way it goes, mystery, exploration, and then heavy action. You kind of want to couch your games or your mini campaigns around that type of format. You don't know what's going on, but you explore a bit. There's a few like encounters with some weird shit, and then this big thing at the end, right? So that's kind of how Aliens at least works, and then Alien in itself a more one-on-one horror type of a situation. And I it's so funny. I was watching just as an aside. I forgot that Tom Skerritt was in that movie as Dallas and Alien, and I saw some in talking like, oh my gosh, Tom Skerritt. Oh yeah, so
Well, Aliens is interesting because really it's James Cameron's Vietnam, right? He took a lot of influence from Vietnam in the way he designed the Marines and in the idea of putting them there and all.
Well, and he talked a lot about when he sort of talked through what he wanted to do with it. One of his big things was, getting into the idea, especially with regard to Ripley, as a sort of version of people re-enlisting after coming back from Vietnam. That was a big thing that he wanted to explore, is the idea of, why do you go back, essentially, if you've been through hell and you have a chance to get out? Why do you go back? And there's a lot of a lot of that is present in Aliens in particular, that is very much, I mean, especially, I think that's a big part of why we see so much that is about like the camaraderie between the Marines early on, right? Because that's sort of the answer, is that it's because of the human connection with the various people that these characters are willing to go into this kind of situation. Yeah. But there's also, I will share, Jason may have heard this story, and Carl may have too. The story goes that when James Cameron had a meeting to pitch a sequel to Alien, which did not do very well in theaters, right? Did not make a whole lot of money, has achieved a sort of cult status since, but didn't make a whole lot of money for the studio originally. Apparently what he did was he went to the whiteboard and he wrote Alien in all caps, like the title. And then he wrote Aliens with the S after, and then he put a slash through the S for $. And that's what got the movie funded to make a second one.
Yeah, Alien was kind of you're right. It didn't do very well in theaters, and it became like the staple, though, of like the science fiction festivals that they would throw to
Well, and it's such a kind of interesting thing, because I think Ridley Scott in general has, I mean, some of his movies did pretty well, right? Like, didn't Gladiator get nominated for Best Picture and stuff? But I think a lot of his movies have a sort of, well, the good ones, the bad ones nobody watches anymore, but the good ones at least have a sort of cult. I mean, like Kingdom of Heaven, I know that at least the director's cut is fairly well regarded by a lot of people who are interested in kind of medievalism, because there's that sort of, I mean, there are plenty of inconsistencies, right? Like Balin, who's a smith who apparently can sword fight just as well as the knights who have been training forever, and all these different things. But that at the core, it's a story that very much a little bit like, didn't BJ talk about The Last Samurai in one of these episodes, and how that's kind of a similar thing, right? Where there's plenty of sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of conceits that are done for the sake of the story, but that ultimately I think it's a movie that's fairly well regarded because the people who like it feel like it sort of captures something about the period and the sort of ethos that it is interested in.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think
Gladiator's another one.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of either of the Scott brothers and most of their movies. I think they're kind of hacks. But that said, Aliens, I think, is a very influential movie. I think that's a great call, Carl, as far as gaming influence. You could do a lot worse to get, if only to get the feel of how you want your game to run and the kind of vibe you want your game to have. You could do a lot worse than watch Aliens, right? But, Cameron really nailed it there. And he did a great job with that. In fact, I based the game off a ripoff of Aliens, or Alien, the original, called Forbidden World, which was done by Roger Corman back in '82. Well, he didn't direct it, but it was a Roger Corman production. But I based a space cowboy game off that worked really well. But it's kind of more sleazy version of Alien, with good synth music in the background. But no, I think Aliens is a great call. I know Arlen is short on time here, so I'm going to throw it to Arlen for his movie next, and then we'll probably come all the way back around.
Yeah. So thinking about this, there's a number of movies that I think could fit here, but I'm going to talk about, I think I'm going to talk about one movie, but I'm going to sort of mention a couple others in there. And that is Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line, which is another war movie based on a book by, I can't remember the author, Jones, maybe something. I don't remember. Anyway, but apparently the book is all right. But the movie is, it's about Guadalcanal, I think. I don't remember which battle of the Pacific War, but it basically starts with the Marines arriving on the island and ends with them leaving. A whole lot less of them, of course, because they've been fighting over the island. And I think what really, there are a couple of things that really appeal to me about this movie. There's a real strong kind of philosophical bent throughout the movie. There's a lot of kind of characters making sort of gnomic statements and sort of talking through their experience, especially with each other, this kind of, all male world of the United States Marine Corps in the Pacific War. And talking about one of the characters is talking about his wife back home a lot. And there's some sequences with her, but there's a lot of this kind of discussion about kind of philosophy and motivation and the possibility of dying, of course, because they're, getting shot at by the Imperial Japanese Army regularly and things like that. And I think that's really interesting. I really like to bring a sense of that kind of sense of sort of a philosophical bent and that kind of discussion of character motivation to my games. But also there's a way in which I think one of the things that really appeals to me about that particular film, not necessarily specific to the story, although I haven't read the book that it's based on, so I don't know how much it's in there. There's a real interest in kind of the relationship between the natural world and the human world that is really present throughout that film. Somebody, I think a film critic, talked about how Terrence Malick is almost more concerned when, a tree blows up from getting hit by a mortar than when a person gets hit by a mortar shell. And that there is, I don't know if that's entirely fair. I think that's a bit of a sort of prejudiced take on the subject, but there is a real interest in this kind of sense of a world that is larger than just the one containing these kind of specific group of men, both the kind of United States Marines that we kind of spend most of the time with, and the Japanese forces that are facing them, because there's a fair bit of that. It's also, it's just gorgeous, right? All of Terrence Malick's movies are just gorgeous. But I think there's something really interesting about this idea. I think it's something that really works well in RPGs as a medium, this kind of concern for the world and almost this kind of sense of like collateral damage and these kind of small moments where you can see a kind of hints of a world that you don't have access to, because I think that's a big part of the film also, that you have these kind of moments where the characters feel like there's kind of the rest of the world out there that they kind of don't have access to because they're in the middle of fighting over this island. And there's also little bits of a character will get shot, and instead of seeing the character fall, we see like a blood splatter across leaves of a fern or something like that. And it's kind of, the sense of the way in which these men interact with their environment, I think is something that is a really interesting thing to explore in RPGs, and especially that it kind of captures the feel of, I think one of the sort of limitations of RPGs at times is that you sort of only have the viewpoints of the player characters to see the world. And so there are a number of ways to get around this, right? You can do a sort of picaresque, the characters advance all throughout the world and see all sorts of crazy things. You can have tales being told of far off lands, all those things, but that sort of sense, and I think it really helps with the sense of kind of verisimilitude, almost that sense that there is a larger world out there beyond just what the characters can see, right? That the characters are seeing their kind of portion of this world that is bigger than just what you can see at the table. And obviously you can't, right? There isn't really a way to do that in the sense of actually showing that, because as soon as you show it, it becomes part of the game at the table. And so it's really about creating the sort of implication of the larger world. And I think that that's one of the things that I really love about The Thin Red Line, is because it does such a really brilliant job of implying this kind of greater and deeper world than just what we have access to on screen.
No, that's great. Just to it is Guadalcanal, and the book's name, or the book's author's name, is James Jones.
James Jones, yeah. Well, he wrote, didn't he do From Here to Eternity also?
Yeah, he wrote a number of books. The Thin Red Line was his fourth novel. Yeah. He if the internet will work with me, which of course it won't. He did From Here to Eternity as well. That was his first novel. So
well, and that was adapted much earlier, right? Because The Thin Red Line is from like late 90s, the film, right? And then the From Here to Eternity was adapted like in the 50s, right? It's much more. Yeah. But well, and then also, almost all of Terrence Malick's movies have some sense of that kind of, that sort of implication of a larger world, right? I mean, The Tree of Life and Days of Heaven in particular have that sort of sense of sort of inaccessible grandeur of life that exists beyond. Well, and the New World has some great moments like that. But The Thin Red Line, I don't know if it's my favorite Terrence Malick movie. I really like The Tree of Life also, although they're in a lot of ways very different films. The Thin Red Line is much more kind of traditional story structure, even if we don't have quite the continuity of characters through it, versus The Tree of Life, for those who haven't seen it, is a film that is sort of about a boy's childhood growing up in a small town in Texas. I think it's supposed to be Waco, but I don't remember. But is also about like the extinction of the dinosaurs and nebulas and, you know, all of these other strange things, and is brilliant, but is kind of this sort of strange, like an attempt to capture almost the sort of patterns of thought, right? Sort of like the way that in literature you can have stream of consciousness writing, sort of a stream of consciousness filmmaking almost. But anyway, The Thin Red Line is my choice for a movie that is inspired by gaming.
Cool.
Very good.
Jason,
So
it's your turn.
yeah, so I am not as deep. I kind of question if RPGs are you can definitely, and this is a conversation Arlen and I are going to have in the future. What it may be on Cerebral, we may put it out as a bonus episode of Cerebrivore, and we might loop other people in. I don't know, but the idea of you know, what are RPGs best suited for? Obviously, you can do a ton of things with RPGs. Arlen's interested in the idea of exploring the kind of stories he was just talking about with RPGs, and I kind of think RPGs are better as their own story form, instead of trying to make them into movies or novels. The idea of using them as a group improv exercise. Obviously, it's not just improv. It's not storytelling. You're using your dice or your cards or whatever. You're using a randomizer to determine the outcome of questionable, you know, events that aren't certain. But the idea of that improv back and forth and just having the story develop as it goes, I think is where RPGs really are their own thing. But that's a future thing. But so that's kind of where I come from.
Jason's cheating and presenting an argument that I don't have time to respond to.
Well, no, because it'll be picked up in the future.
Yeah. We'll talk about that more later.
Yeah, but I bring that up because when I talk about like the movies that inspire, typically when I take inspiration from movies, I'll take the base plot or the idea or the problem from movie or bits from movie, and then use that to do a game. And the game may not end anything like the movie did, because I'm not trying to ape necessarily, you know, and I'm not saying you guys are trying to do that either. It's you get the feel of the movie and you want to use that in a game. So like I've taken Captain Chronos Vampire Hunt, an old Hammer horror film, and used that to base a game around. And we ran that, and that worked really well. That's a world where different vampires have different weaknesses and different properties. To minor spoiler for Captain Chronos, but this happens at the very opening of the movie, the beginning of the movie. But so like there's a one type of vampire that instead of sucking blood and does like your typical Bram Stoker thing, it actually sucks effectively the life out of in the victim's age, right? So your 20-year-old girl that gets you know attacked by this vampire and fed on by the vampire now looks like a 80-year-old woman, right? She's withered up and her life's been sucked out of her, and they have different weaknesses, and you have to figure out what their weaknesses are. Then forge, you know, it might be wood for some, it might be cold iron for others, or whatever, right? So I've used that in games. I've often used Westerns, right? I've often used, you know, Western movies, whether just a, you know, variety like El Dorado I've used before, the movie El Dorado with, you know, John Wayne, James Caan, and Dean Martin, and use that base and then just let it spiral out. So that's kind of what I do with movies typically, is I'll find something I like and then start the scenario off, and then wherever it rolls to, and, you know, like I say, it may not end. And oftentimes I'll switch genres as well, right? So when I did El Dorado, I did it as a space game. And that way it wasn't, you know, but Westerns are really good for that because you can adapt them to pretty much any genre, that base storyline. But when we talk about movies that do inspire, you watch the movie, you're like, I want to run a game around that. Of course, the dogs want to play just as I'm talking, so I can't mute. But you know, The Professionals is one that comes to mind. Or, you know, and if you haven't seen The Professionals, it's, you know, a group of men in the West are hired to get a rancher's wife back who's been taken by bandits in Mexico. And of course, everything's not as it seems. But they have to go and raid the camp and do all this thing. It'd be a great adventure to write up, or something like Seven Samurai, which we see made into a variety of movies, right? But Seven Samurai would be a great scenario to run.
Right.
The idea.
They did a warm. What is that? Dirty Dozen? No. Wait, there was a movie.
Well, the Dirty Dozen isn't really Seven Samurai.
No, it's not that. There was another movie that. Oh, there was a Western with Yul Brynner.
Yeah, the Magnificent Seven.
Seven.
Yeah, Magnificent Seven.
And then they remade, because they did multiple, right? Because there was the original Magnificent Seven, and then the remake that is the one that people know about, and then the new remake that apparently was not very good. And I saw like 30 minutes of and thought it was not very good.
Yeah, I don't recommend.
Definitely that. Defending a village against the oppressor is a very common trope. And I've seen that in several different.
Well, even like there's an episode of The Mandalorian, right? That is sort of like that, right?
Seven Samurai.
Yeah.
It's a classic story you can use, like Arlen said, you can use across whether it's, feudal Japan, whether it's the Old West, whether it's the space and Star Wars, or obviously doing any kind of fantasy, that this army is coming to the village, you have to protect it. There's a universal story you can adapt. So that's kind of what I do. So I'm kind of cheating because I don't have one movie that necessarily.
I think you got to pick one.
You got to pick one.
If you don't pick one, I'm going to pick one for you, and you're going to have to talk about it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Maybe a movie by Ridley Scott, since he dislikes the Scott brothers so much.
Or are you of the opinion that Conan the Destroyer is like the best D&D movie?
Oh yeah,
ever?
but Conan the Destroyer. You talked about Conan the Destroyer.
The reason I say Conan Destroyer is a good D&D movie is you have a party. You have a thief, you have a magician, you have a couple fighters. So it's not, and it's an okay, fun fantasy movie. It's not a great Conan movie, right? But if we pretend
I think okay else, is a little generous to it. It's not very good.
Didn't they recapitulate the mirror scene from Enter the Dragon?
Yeah, more or less, right? Yeah, the mirror scene. But you think about it, but you have that great.
There is a movie that could influence a game.
Definitely. You could definitely do Enter the Dragon. You could do that martial arts tournament and everybody get called in but you give people different missions, right? So one guy's, and you give every player a different thing. So you do Enter the Dragon, you have Enter the Dragon, but you give people their secret missions in addition to, obviously everybody wants to win the martial arts tournament, right? But one character is there investigating his missing sister or whatever. One character is there to try to join up with the gang. He's trying to join up with Mr. Hand, right? So, and you can do different things, right? And so I think you could do a lot with that. Definitely. Enter the Dragon's a great call, Carl. I do think Conan the Destroyer is a better movie than people give it credit for. Because what else do we have in that time frame? Now, like Beastmaster is a pretty fun movie too.
I mean, we have
in there.
Conan the Barbarian. That's a vastly better movie than Destroyer.
Well, sure, as a sword and sorcery movie, not as a D&D movie, right? I
mean, just in general as a movie, Barbarian is a much better film, like just as a film, than Destroyer is. In my opinion.
Sure, but that's not. But just being a good film doesn't mean it's a good prompt for an RPG, right?
Or Red Sonja. I mean, come on.
Well, there you go. I mean, really, you want to look at like a lot of fantasy and magical elements in there. You can look at Deathstalker. Now, Deathstalker is a very rapey movie, another Roger Corman movie. But that said, you've got a pig-headed orc in Deathstalker. You've got like effectively basically like ogres, or you have basically Neanderthal, like regressed humans. So I don't know what you want to call them in that world, but you have those in there. You have real magic in there. You have a guy that gets polymorphed into a woman as a disguise, not like as a punishment, but like to sneak in and trick somebody. You have all this kind of cool stuff in there. You have this king that's lost his land. He's living out alone in the forest, and he tasked Deathstalker with this mission. Yeah, but again, we have a tournament. The whole idea with Deathstalker is the evil wizard's calling all the heroes to come have this big tournament, and the reason is he wants them to kill each other off so they're not a threat to him, which is really cool. So Deathstalker is a movie you could definitely make into a great scenario very easily. You just leave all the rapey bits out. But yeah, so there are a lot of great movies out there. Conan is my favorite sword and sorcery movie.
The Barbarian.
Conan the Barbarian, the original,
the good one,
not the Jason Momoa one.
Not the
the
which
Jason
is a good
Momoa
movie on its own, but it's not a Conan movie, right?
Yes.
Conan the Barbarian with Schwarzenegger is my favorite sword and sorcery, and Excalibur is my favorite fantasy movie. I separate the two.
That's interesting. Yeah, Excalibur actually does is a lot of one of those quotables too. You know, I guess
Mm-hmm.
that's where you get the staying power in a game and how it influences your game at the table too, right? Not just like Aliens, as I was saying, everyone throws in those quips that you know Hudson, Hicks, Vasquez, etc. throw in, but same thing with Excalibur. You know, let the boy try, let the boy try. In fact, when I ran Pendragon and we had the Sword and Stone scene, sure, it's more like the Disney Sword and the Stone that takes place in London, right? But not out in the wilderness like in Excalibur. But people were yelling, you know, player characters or players were yelling through their player character, let the boy try, let the, you know, I want to say Jean-Luc Picard, but like Patrick Stewart was yelling as King Leo de Grance, right?
Well, it's a great cast, right? You have Liam Neeson, and we have I'm brain farting on the name of the guy that plays Merlin. He's in Exorcist 3 too. Great, big drunk.
He's got a weird name. It's like
he's interesting actor. Apparently, he's really difficult to work with. But the thing that always surprises me with Excalibur is you know the Quest for Holy Grail came out prior to Excalibur, predates Excalibur. You would think it'd be the other way around, right? You would think Holy Grail's aping Excalibur, but it's really not because Holy Grail actually came out prior to. Of course, Holy Grail is the other movie that we think about. Every gamer quote, or not every gamer, but is often quoted in gaming circles. Is Monty Python's Quest for Holy Grail.
Excalibur's not even the best King Arthur movie. Come on, man.
It's
that's
true. We do have Guy Ritchie's Excalibur. That's
the King Arthur Legend of the Sword is not good either. No, the best King Arthur movie is called Lancelot of the Lake, and it's so good. It's just brilliant. It's
a French movie, right?
It is a French movie. It is set in the aftermath of the Grail quest. Many of the knights have either died on the quest or gone off. A few of them have returned, and it begins with Lancelot returning to Camelot. Most of the film is Lancelot and Arthur and Mordred and Gawain and Guinevere sort of talking with each other and trying to work out what's going to happen. And there's, of course, the sort of sense of the impending collapse of Arthur's dream. And in particular, of course, Lancelot's attempt to resolve his kind of ethical dilemma, right? He's been away from Guinevere for many years. He sort of says that he's done with the whole affair with Guinevere thing. And of course, it's not quite that easy as it never seems to be. But it's a really, really brilliant film. There's some really great kind of stylistic choices, similar to Excalibur in the sense that the men always seem to be armored in like full plate mail. And yet, unlike Excalibur, there's a real attempt to bring across the noise of plate mail is one of this kind of recurring motifs, the way that the men just kind of clank and jingle and all of that as they walk, and the noise that they make on kind of creaking floorboards, and this kind of sense of, I mean, in the film thematically, there's this sense of the sort of, way that the sort of greatness of these men is causing something that is actually sort of nasty for the world, right? Which is sort of what the film is about, right? That there's sort of too much greatness to go around in this sort of concentrated space of Arthur's court once all of these knights have returned, and once they're not kind of bound by the kind of sort of ethics that were espoused at the beginning of the courtly time. And there's a lot of discussion between men who, even though in the film we don't see any of the kind of earlier adventures of these men, there's a real great sense of the pre-existing relationship between these characters that has gone on for a long time, right? In the way that, in certain movies, we definitely have elements of that, although some of them get to cheat a little bit, right? The Star Trek films from the original trilogy or from the Next Generation, the original cast, the original series, that's what I was looking for. And the Next Generation, right, get to sort of cheat with that because we've seen a whole bunch of TV show of the relationship between these characters. And so we know about the kind of long relationship between Spock and Kirk and McCoy. But then in this film, even where we don't have any of that kind of shown on screen, there's a great sense of, Lancelot's devotion to Arthur and love for Guinevere and the incompatibility of the two, which is at the center of the film. But in my opinion, it really, perhaps more than any other film, at least that I've seen, gets at the sort of some of the real thematic details of the Arthurian myth, especially in Thomas Mallory's version, which to kind of segue for a second, Thomas Mallory, for those of you who don't know, wrote Le Morte d'Arthur, which is the sort of most complete version of the Arthurian myth that we have. It's kind of an odd thing because he died before he could do much editing or completing on it. And there are a number of places where there are sort of competing myths or competing legends that he recorded that seem to be fundamentally incompatible. One of my favorites is that in Thomas Mallory's version, the sword in the stone is not Excalibur. The sword in the stone is called Clarent, and Excalibur is given to him by the Lady of the Lake. In other versions of the story, often Clarent is broken or misplaced or somehow not usable, and that's why Arthur needs Excalibur. But in Thomas Mallory's version, Arthur has two different swords that he gets, both of which signal divine right to rule in themselves independently. And then part of the problem is that when Arthur is away with Excalibur on campaign, Mordred ends up stealing Clarent. And so then he's got a sword that signals his divine right to rule. And that's kind of part of the story, is this sort of exuberance, this sort of excessiveness of meaning that is, I think, really central to at least what I love about Arthurian mythology, that I think Lancelot at the Lake really gets at in a wonderful way, this kind of way in which there's almost kind of sort of too much history, too much kind of grandeur, too much kind of passion in these characters for it to be stable and perpetual, right? That Arthur has kind of done too good a job of creating this round table of the greatest knights in all the world, because it turns out you kind of want a table with like maybe one or two great knights and the rest of them kind of mediocre, so that they don't all end up, destroying each other in the collapse of the kingdom.
Yeah, that's fair. But so what I'm hearing is the Lancelot of the Lake is the best King Arthur movie, but I'm not hearing that it's a better fantasy movie than Excalibur. So,
well, there's also
my argument.
Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films that are pretty excellent too.
Sure.
They don't hold a candle to the animated from Basky and Rankin and Bass. But I will say that Merlin was played by Nicole Williamson, because I was blanking on his name. And
Nicole, that's what I just said. Nicole. There's actually, I'm looking at Helen Mirren, Liam Neeson, Nigel Terry,
Gabriel Byrne,
Syrian Hines, who played Caesar in Rome. For those, Patrick Stewart, Robert Addy.
It's a great cast. It's amazing.
Gabriel Byrne is Uther.
Yeah, it's amazing.
A lot of
and Borman's daughter is the one that gets raped. Well, his son is young. Mordred,
young
right?
Mordred, yeah.
Yeah. So I won't argue it's the best King Arthur film to match the Mallory Legends. I will say it's the best fantasy film.
So when was Mallory?
Those are different things.
Arlen, very briefly, when was Mallory made? Because I'm wondering if that two sword thing is maybe germane or influenced by what's going on in England at the time. When was?
Well, yeah. So Thomas Mallory died before which one? Bosworth is the last of the War of the Roses.
Oh, so War of the Roses, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So Thomas Mallory served Warwick during the War of the Roses, and he was like a serious reprobate. Like he went to jail, went to prison for rape in his lifetime, right? He was, which is one of those things that like, it's not necessarily easy for a noble person to get convicted of raping a woman in that period.
Look at The Last Duel, if you've seen The Last Duel or read about it.
Yeah, it's like a real demonstration. Thomas Mallory was like a real reprobate in his lifetime, which is another, it's a classic complicated thing, the art from the artist.
That's interesting. It's during the War of the Roses, so that is totally, why there probably are two divine rights. He's not, Lancaster versus York or whatever, even if he had done it and throughout England, I guess.
Well, and similarly, there's other bits and pieces that are fascinating. So there's one of my favorite stories is Balin Le Savage, who is a knight that the Balin story appears early in Le Morte d'Arthur, but Balin ends up basically chasing an invisible knight, Sir Garland, to this castle. and there's a feast going on, and Balin shows up, and Sir Garland, who is now visible, basically smacks him across the face. So Balin does what any good knight would do and chops his head off, and then finds out that Garland is the brother of King Pellam, whose castle it is. And so Balin and Pellam end up fighting, and Balin ends up breaking his sword in the fight with Pellam and runs off into the castle and finds a spear set on kind of a golden platter and grabs it and uses it to stab King Pellam. And of course, it's the Holy Lance, as in the lance that Longinus used to pierce the side of Jesus on the cross. So there's sort of implications from that. But part of what is really interesting with the story is that later on, there is a second sword in the stone that appears at Camelot about halfway through Arthur's reign. And it is Balin's sword, and it is pulled out of the stone by Galahad, who is the one who ends up finding the Holy Grail and healing King Pellam. But you might be like putting together, wait a second, didn't Balin's sword brast in sunder, as Thomas Mallory put it in his wonderful language, in the fight with Pellam? How is the sword whole again to be in the stone and repeat this ritual that I thought was King Arthur's thing, right? It's a sword in the stone at Camelot. What the hell is going on? And Galahad, who is Lancelot's son, basically, I mean, it's kind of complicated, but Lancelot basically gets date raped. The King Pellam's daughter pretends to be Guinevere to have sex with Lancelot in order to conceive Galahad. And that's what sort of breaks Lancelot's resolve, because it's the first time that he does the dirty with Guinevere in his mind. And then he finds out that it's not even Guinevere. And he's like, well, I've, lost my honor for nothing. I better, have some fun now anyway, which T.H. White does a great job with in his version of the story in The Once and Future King. But there's something really, I think, fascinating about the way that these kind of mythic elements in Thomas Mallory, some of which we are very familiar with and some of which we are almost totally unfamiliar with, right? Galahad having a sword in the stone also is something that very, very rarely appears in later other versions of the story.
Yeah, and actually in Excalibur, it's Percival, which is a totally different, it's a German origin story.
And Percival's interesting too, because Percival has, in certain versions of the story, Percival has this kind of wonderful, brain dead quality, for lack of a better term. It's not very nice to say, but Percival is sort of this knight with no interiority in some versions of the story, where he just doesn't have like anything going on in his head. He just kind of does. Yeah. And there's something fascinating about that in Arthurian mythology too, because there's this sort of wonderful, and it gets sort of back to what I was talking about having kind of a larger world that you don't have access to. And Thomas Mallory, one of the things that I really like about his story as literature is that he does a wonderful job of kind of implying the sort of inner life of these knights without actually kind of getting much into it, right? I've been reading Dune recently, and in Dune, in the book, Frank Herbert, basically every paragraph has a inside somebody's head what they're thinking moment of here's how they responded to this particular situation. Thomas Mallory is not like that. Thomas Mallory just sort of gives us kind of the external world of these knights and implies that they have these kind of things going on inside them, which I think is it's an interesting thing that we've sort of lost almost in the movement away from the medieval world. But that sort of makes Percival really interesting, because Percival doesn't have anything inside to imply that it's there. And so Percival is just this is like this automaton who goes about questing and kicking ass and taking names with like nothing going on inside. He's like a Terminator basically. And it's fascinating.
In Excalibur, they just make him stumble around and fall into peril and somehow luckily survive the peril. Right. So in a way they kind of hearken to that, I would say.
Yeah. Well, and I
stumbling, bumbling,
familiar with
force of nature, right?
Yeah. He's just sort of somehow like functions without any like capacity to reason his way through problems. He just kind of does things and succeeds because he's this kind of special knight. And it's, fascinating stuff. Yeah. And that would be interesting. Yeah. I think
to wait for Arlen to run Pendragon then.
Yeah, well, and to sort of close off the discussion, it seems like we're getting towards the end of my time. I guess Jason and Carl could talk for longer. I think that would be really interesting in a game to have a character who is sort of like Percival, right? Sort of no interiority at all. Wouldn't that be kind of a fascinating thing to have it might be difficult in a party that if the party was like, dude, what the hell is wrong with you for your character? But I think it would be an interesting kind of character concept to have as sort of part of at least of a world, maybe not of the player character's party, but to have this kind of, like a Terminator with no interiority at all, just kind of processing. Wouldn't that be kind of a fascinating element of a story?
That's interesting. So you could put in a little blurb, like a little background blurb for pre-gen that you could make. No, this character has no interiority.
Yeah. Character doesn't think about things. Character doesn't rationally logic through things. Character has nothing going on in their head. They just
alignment, chaotic, neutral.
Well, no, I mean, because look at like Deadwood. Have you both of you guys seen Deadwood?
No.
Yeah.
But I don't.
Yeah. Well, so Timothy Oliphant's character, the sheriff, right? Now he obviously has motives and desire, but he reacts. He doesn't think before he goes, and he'll do the dumbest things, but he doesn't care.
You're like, why are you doing this? Why?
Yeah, and because he's a quote unquote temper, right? And so he just reacts. And that would be what I would think that kind of character would play out in a game, right?
Yeah. Well, it's sort of almost like having a script or a heuristic that is just, if X then Y thing, right? But that might be I think that might be kind of an interesting concept to have in a world. There's some other I'm thinking about. I mean, there's other stories that have kind of elements of that, but in particular, R. Scott Baker's The Second Apocalypse series has a character, the White Luck Warrior, that has a little bit of that going on, who is this kind of weird, holy reincarnated Avenger that the gods have sent to make sure that the Second Apocalypse, the titular Second Apocalypse, doesn't actually happen. And who doesn't have, there are sequences from his point of view, and he doesn't have information processing the way the rest of us do. He just sort of exists across all of his lifetime at once. And so he doesn't have any way to react to things, right? He doesn't have any sense of kind of how things of sort of the cause and effect that the rest of us have. He just sort of does things, right? Because he can't respond to cause and effect. He just sort of operates, which is kind of an interesting thing. I don't know how you could get that across in an RPG in a way that would be really fun to play and also, interesting for everybody at the table and all of that.
Yeah, they did that with Dennis Hopper's character in Firestarter 2 when they did that miniseries on Sci-Fi, where he was effective. He wasn't omniscient per se, but he could perceive like time, he could perceive the whole timeline kind of thing for his life. And I don't know.
Or a little bit like Dr. Manhattan in Watchmen, right?
Exactly.
Dr. Manhattan is just,
it's a better
why would I intervene in anything? Because it's all happened already.
It's all going to happen already. Yeah, it's all happening.
Mm-hmm. But still, he was surprised, right?
Yeah, but he was still
Watchmen. Watchmen, another influential movie.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know how influential the movie is, although I think the movie is.
The series was really good.
The series, I haven't seen the series yet. I think the movie is better than a lot of people give it credit for, which is to say that I think it's fairly well put together. It's just, I think the big thing is it's not what the sort of casual movie fans were expecting, because it's really not like a superhero action story, right? It's basically a noir murder mystery that happens to have superheroes.
Well, it's a deconstruction of the superhero genre, and the problem is it came out too early in the current superhero movie cycle.
Yeah. If it had come out about like 5 or 10 years later, I think people would have understood a lot more about
exactly. Deadpool and The Boys and all these modern deconstructions cash in on that.
Yeah.
But Watchmen was too early in the cycle, I think. And
I think a lot of the kind of serious fans of the comic who probably weren't going to be pleased with anything basically looked at it and said, why would I watch this instead of just reading the comic book? And there is some truth there to, why would you watch this instead of reading the comic book? I think there is a real criticism in there, but I also think that there's some people who, don't appreciate the way that, I think Zack Snyder is kind of a complicated figure, but I do think that he has a real sense of motion in moving pictures, right? He has a really strong sense. I think about in 300, there's one sequence where Leonidas breaks from the phalanx and is cutting down Persians left and right. And it's the movement of the Persian forces in the background going one way across the screen and him moving the other way, and the camera pulled along behind him. That is such a great kind of visual description of that story, because it's about this kind of, the force of one great man against the world is what 300 is about. And that's such a great, a visual shorthand for conveying the way that Leonidas is sort of pulling us along in his wake, even as the world is moving the other direction. That I think is, dude knows how to put together interesting action scenes. At least I mean, I think there is a real criticism of dude's got some weird things. I mean, if you've seen Sucker Punch, there's some weird shit in that one, but
I think he was trying to do something he wasn't really correctly qualified to do, right?
Yeah.
He had good intentions, but the execution was flawed.
Yeah.
I think with Sucker Punch.
I think that's a fair statement about Sucker Punch, certainly.
He should have got a woman involved with it. And he should, and now I think his wife works with him a lot, though. So so that may not be a fair.
Well, and part of it also, I mean, like the original version, the original cut of Justice League that Joss Whedon finished for him that sucked, and people were like, "Oh, it's Zack Snyder's fault," and I don't know how true that is, but it's not his fault that he couldn't work on it, right? It's because didn't his daughter die or something like that?
They had death in the family, his daughter or something. But no, his version of Justice League is vastly superior.
Much better than the Whedon cut.
Go if you don't have HBO, you need to get your free trial and watch Zack Snyder's cut of the Justice League, because that's the proper.
Although again, there is a little bit of it starts in 4:3 and says this film is presented in 4:3 to preserve Zack Snyder's artistic vision or something like that. It's like, dude, like I get it, but also like that's not what this movie is, right? Like similar to Sucker Punch in some ways there. You know what I'm getting at. Yeah. I think I need to hop off, unfortunately, because my ride's almost here. But I really had a great time. Thanks for hosting, Jason. Hope all the listeners enjoyed some rambles, and I'll talk to you guys soon.
Definitely. We're going to hang on for a little bit longer, talk about you after you hop off.
All right.
We will thank you guys. And, we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Yeah. We're not really going to hold on. Of course, right? I get email from work right in the middle of all this, right? Anyway.
No, it's actually pretty interesting because it kind of diverged, which I think is fun. It's a fun divergence. It seems like subconsciously maybe we are influenced by a lot of the Arthurian legend that Arlen talked about, in running especially maybe our high fantasy type of games, right? Knights in shining armor. Him talking about all the interactions about and that's what happens, right? If you run a campaign for a long time, all of a sudden your players all become, lords and have their domains and stuff like that. And is too much greatness a bad thing? Does too much greatness in a game end up being a bad thing, right? So I think a lot of us are influenced by this idea of what Arlen talked about through Mallory and Lancelot of the Lake and Excalibur. Right? So
definitely. Well, one thing I would like to do. I mean, we see
your dog jumps on the.
Well, yeah, Maddie wants to be involved, but he's a good boy. One thing I would like to do is take Pendragon and use it. It would take a lot of hacking. Well, it wouldn't take a lot of hacking, but use the idea of Pendragon, your generational game, right, with the seasons and all that.
Yeah.
But adapt that to BattleTech, the BattleTech world, pre-Clan Invasion, BattleTech world.
Yeah, I guess you could do that with the sci-fi.
Yeah, there's got to be a way to do that, and maybe you're adapting the ideas that how Pendragon works is more than the actual system. Because if you did that, this would be a kind of game almost you want to do face to face. You could do it online. You don't want to do the battles with actual BattleTech rules, right? Mm-hmm. But you'd have to pick. Well, I guess you could easily. You just have to come up with different skills and stuff, but you could adapt and change you'd have to change the passions up a little bit, obviously,
right?
But I think you could adapt that to that. And that'd be kind of a neat game where you're doing the battles, using the BattleTech rules, which if you want to do it with Pendragon, obviously you just pick what war game, historical war game rules are your choice, do the big battles, right? Yeah. But I think there's something there where you could do that with, I know Pendragon has Chaosium has published big battle rules for it.
Yeah, there's a battle system, but it's kind of like, it's in a way, it's what I adapted for some of my historical games where you don't go blow by blow during the battle,
right? Which works great.
You roll like a particular skill for a particular phase depending on what happens.
And that worked great for for those games, but I think it'd be neat to do like
you could adapt
battle, right?
An actual battle, an actual war game or a battle for it, and have the players, depending on their station, if they're participants or actual,
or they could even just switch. But so with BattleTech, because obviously you're doing that, you're going to be, well, depending where you start, whether you're in charge of a mercenary company, or you're one of the houses somewhere in one of the houses, and a general or an officer in one of the houses. But you could figure that out. But I don't know. I'd like to try that sometime. I don't want to, but I'm sure Arlen has ideas on that stuff too. So I don't want to cut him off. And unfortunately, he didn't get to defend some of Ridley Scott's worst atrocities.
Like what?
What should we name his worst atrocities? Like Robin Hood? Like,
oh, that was which one is that? The Robin Hood with Russell Crowe?
Yes,
that was
like Exodus, Gods and Kings, where he tries to defend using Christian Bale. Well, nobody will come see a person of color as the lead. Get out of here.
Yeah. I mean, although I have like we're watching on YouTube recently, Amy and I are watching like historical accuracy in certain films, and some Roman scholars, even though they say historically it's very, very anachronistic, the costuming, the formations, etc., that they show in Gladiator are pretty accurate, aside from the trebuchet throwing fire, but in the opening scene. But and they even so scholars of Rome, or Roman scholars, at least on the YouTube, who they hire to do these spots, suggested that Gladiator was pretty good. I mean, costume wise. I mean, one of the best ones, of course, is Rome. But although again, in Rome, there's some anachronisms too, and one of the main characters never really existed or had died by then, right? So.
Well, I think you're always going to have some in that. I think that's one of the beauties of, and I know you weren't able to join the chat we did over my show about the Northman, but one of the beauties of the Northman is it doesn't try to be exactly historically accurate. It's more that mythic thing. So they're able to meld a little bit, right?
Right?
But even that said, it's still probably the most historically accurate depiction we have, even though a lot of things aren't super historically accurate. Because you look at historically, the Vikings have not been shown very accurately in film, or even
horn
helmets.
Helmets. I mean, the most recent show, I guess, is
the Vikings. Yeah,
but
at
least they don't have horn helmets. But in a way, that's sort of mythic too, because actually, the whole story about the main character. I can't remember the father of everyone in Vikings.
Oh, it's been a while since I've seen it. Shoot, I could look it up, I guess.
Yeah, I'm looking it up right now.
Okay, yeah.
Ragnar Lothbrok, right? That's all mythic, legendary anyway, right? So they do, and I think they do touch on those elements. They're not trying to, and they say we're not trying to be historically accurate. In fact, they compress a lot of things that happened during the initial Viking invasions by the Scandinavians into England and the Danelaw, et cetera. And they compress all that. And of course, like a lot of stuff from Ivar the Boneless, are not really quite accurate. Although, but some of the battles, they do kind of, in a way, they they blend the legends and the mythic, right? Because there are visions of Odin, the Ragnar's whole relationship with his second wife, who's supposed to be like a demigod, right? So they do kind of throw those mythical elements. I don't think they're trying to be historically accurate, though. That's kind of the knock they get, but I never felt that way.
Well, I guess I mean more in the definitely, and they admit that, but I guess more in the idea of like the structures and the clothing and that kind of.
Well, for sure, they've gotten props for all that, right?
But they're nowhere near as to what they did with the Northman.
No.
I guess where I'm going with that. But really quickly before people think I hate everything Ridley Scott did. I mean, I won't argue. Alien, is a great movie. Blade Runner, although I personally like the theatrical cut. I like the cut with the where he talks, so the over what do you call it, the voiceover, and some of his other movies aren't horrible, but I'm just not a big fan. So like I say, with his brother Tony Scott, I mean, I don't mind I think Domino is an interesting way to tell a movie. And it's interesting, based on a bounty hunter. Have you seen Domino?
No.
Oh, really? Domino is it's worth checking out. It's kind of, I don't think it's on anything streaming right now, but it's got what it has is Keira Knightley plays this famous female bounty hunter. It's a myth, obviously a bigger than life telling of the story, like Skip Tracer here in America, modern day. But it's got Mickey Rourke's in there, Edgar Ramirez is in there. It's actually Lucy Liu's in it. It's actually an interesting movie about this Los Angeles bounty hunter, and it's kind of good. But
speaking of, just to drop back to gaming for a second, speaking of Ridley Scott and Blade Runner, I've just got the PDFs of from the Blade Runner game, the starter set and the core book.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear.
It looks like it uses like the Twilight 2000 variation of the rules. I was flipping through it, which is good. Maybe that means that Amy might play.
Yeah, I'm really curious. Like I've said before, I'm going to live vicariously through you because I didn't back the Kickstarter. So I'm curious to see. My big curiosities as you go forward, and hopefully you'll talk about this on your show after you had a chance to read through, are the idea of character development. I know right now, I do know you can either accumulate basically profession points by being a good cop or humanity points by doing human things as a good human. I know that isn't a good grammar sentence thing, but those conflict with each other. There are things that give you humanity points that will actually knock you down in your rating as a cop, from my understanding. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that dynamic and its investigation, how the mechanics they have to encourage investigations. I'm curious in your thoughts on that once you read it, obviously.
Yeah, I wonder if I know a lot of the things that companies do, they have these starter sets, and sometimes the starter set is not quite the full rules or truncated version of the rules, and it can be very different. So hopefully that might not be the case. I don't know. But they gave us at least a core rule book to work with as well to kind of kick through. The format's kind of, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of like everything looks like a sidebar format. Seems to me, the focus is on the presentation, just looking at it. And I guess maybe this is topical because Blade Runner is another one of those, I think, movies that influences a lot of our conception and feel of that type of near future, sci-fi noir type of game, right? So,
definitely,
But they've taken the Daniel Norton will appreciate this. They've taken sort of the how in Coriolis they have like a text on a backdrop of some piece of art. That's kind of how the format is with the in most of everything. But the some of the art is really kind of cool. So so a lot of stuff to parse through. I don't know how much time I have. I need to be better about that.
Well, I like I say, no rush. I do look forward to your impressions. I'm especially curious in the idea of the character progression, the different point systems they have, and the conflict there, because everybody's Blade Runner in this game, right? Is my understanding. Like everybody's.
Yeah, it says you're Blade Runner skills and specialties.
Yeah. So everybody.
I don't think you can.
So.
I don't know if there is a. I don't know the core concepts. Oh, you can be a replicant,
right? But but like in the new, like in Blade Runner 2046, you're still Blade Runner, though. I think.
Oh, you're a replicant.
Blade Runner.
You're a replicant that hunts down. Right.
Yeah, other replicants. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I could be wrong, but I think you're stuck playing cops in that game. So, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think it's an interesting design decision that they hewed so closely to the source material. I would be remiss, and this is a quick divergence before we stop recording. I don't dislike as many of Tony Scott's movies as I do his brother, because Tony Scott did do The Last Boy Scout, which is an amazing movie. So, and I'll leave it at that. But anyway, I appreciate your coming on talking. I'm sorry that this is such a truncated. But it's a bonus episode, right? So we're allowed to be all over the place and talk about different things.
That's the fun of it. Do we get? I don't know. What does that look like? People listening to main versus bonus, or are we getting more feedback from? I feel like we got
the listenership's about the same for both.
Okay.
Yeah.
As long as we're consistent, I guess.
Yeah, and we're getting feedback on both. I think not getting as much feedback as we'd like. So if you're listening to this and you have comments for us, you want to give us a hard time on what we talked about the films. You have comments on Arlen's commentary on King Arthur. You agree with Arlen, you don't. You agree with us on films, you don't. You want to defend the Scott brothers against me. Please call in, let us know. And you can call in, you go to the anchor page for Cerebrivore. You can leave a message there. You can send an email to cerebrivore@gmail.com. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can leave a comment in the YouTube comments. We'll read your comment, or if you send us an audio message, we'll play it on the air. We love to get feedback, so please give us feedback. And I guess with that, we'll talk to everybody next week. So.
All right, bye-bye. Say bye, Arlen.
A Nerd Central broadcast, Cerebrivore podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the spinal tap straw. The all-stars and pods past, Cerebrivore podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. Something's playing teeth, or soon escaping your brain. What I mean is this machine's a freak, and from what I understand, don't look now, the Cerebrivore is coming, and all that's left is the crying and the running. You can bring it, you can hide, I'll think above in any order. Just another ring of real tossers running for the border. Just a snap like a one, can I stutter? Here am here, it's always bread and butter. You can eat on a baby, and his customers never say it. It's savoring the flavor of the movies it creates.